started.
So I guess thank you again for joining us, Dr. Johnstone.
My pleasure. Very happy to be here.
Do you have an introductory?
Well, we were reading some of the articles and books and chapters and things that you've published, and came across a sort of theme of the Secretary General and sort of the role of the SG, and we're really excited because we've got Jukeres coming in January, and there's a lot of arguments that we talk about amongst our friends and different club members about the role of the SG, where the legitimacy comes from, who should be SG, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What sort of have you written about to answer that?
Yeah. And well, of course, as you know, we now know who the next Secretary General is going to be. So that's kind of a good moment to be talking about this question. So I actually worked for two different Secretary Generals myself, and as you say, I've written about it and researched it and stayed sort of close to the UN over the years. So I've had a chance to kind of observe what the Secretary General does. And the starting point is that the UN is an organization of member states, and so the member states are really the ones who drive the agenda of the organization. But within that framework, the Secretary General can actually be fairly influential, in a few different ways. Even in the sort of administrative role of managing or administering or serving the member states, part of that includes managing big peace operations, managing complex humanitarian operations. So the member states will give the mandate, and the member states will provide the troops if troops are involved. But the day-to-day management of it is really done by those who are in the field and those in the Secretariat, overseen, of course, by the Secretary General. So even in this administrative function, it's an important, influential position that can shape the direction in which a peace operation will take or a humanitarian mission will take. And then, beyond that, the Secretary General has a political role. Again, sometimes it's when asked to take on this political role by the member states, but sometimes it's done independently, offering his services to help mediate a conflict, for example. And of course, if the parties to the conflict say, no, we're not interested, then there's not so much a Secretary General can do. But a lot of times, the approach will be well received. So I could go on, but there are ways in which, and I suppose my central theme is there are ways in which a Secretary General can be influential that aren't so obvious if you just look at the UN Charter or you look at the structure of the organization.
Right, that really reminds me, the phrase that I really latched onto in one of the papers was the idea of the unique legitimacy of the Secretary General in those roles. And something we were discussing in our advocates group is what lends that legitimacy to the role of Secretary General? Is it a meritocracy? Is it something where what work has come before the stepping into the position of SG that gives the SG legitimacy, or is it more so identity? Should we be deciding who takes that leadership position based upon who they are or what they've done?
So the argument for this time that it should be an Eastern European woman, and you saw nearly every Eastern European state put forward their candidate. It ended up being Guterres because of his experience with the UNHCR.
Well, the interesting thing about the question is that is it the legitimacy of the office or the legitimacy of the individual?
Right.
And I think those are two separate things. The legitimacy of the office comes from the simple fact that this is the chief executive officer of the only global organization that has a political mandate in addition to other mandates. And so just by that mere fact, it lends a certain weight to the individual, whoever it may be, that even a head of state won't have, because it's not necessarily representing a particular interest, a particular state, a particular agenda, but in effect trying to speak for the humanity as a whole. That's a grandiose, a grandiose way of understanding it, but it does mean that if the Secretary General has credibility and speaks, the words will be heard differently from the way they would be heard spoken by somebody who's seen as more representing a particular interest or agenda. Now that relates to the individual, and there, I suppose the individual can have a credibility coming into the job. I think Guterres does. I actually think he's a really good choice to be Secretary General. But it's also how they use the position.
Right.
And you can either build your own legitimacy and credibility, or you can squander it.
Right.
And a big challenge for the individual is to decide exactly when to weigh in, when to hold back, when to speak out, when to do the work quietly, when to say something which you know is going to offend one of the great powers, because it needs to be said. On the other hand, if you've offended the great powers, it may minimize your ability to do other things. So that's a really, that's an art. And you know, some Secretary Generals have been more effective at that than others.
Predictions for how Guterres will...
As I say, I think he's got, coming into it, I think he's got the right kind of background for this. He's, first of all, he's been the Prime Minister of a country. That means he's got both the sort of stature that comes with that. He's going to be able to speak to the heads of state and heads of government and foreign ministers with that kind of stature, but also the political savvy that comes with that, you know, don't you? But then he's also got the experience as a High Commissioner for Refugees. So that means he's worked within the UN system, and he's worked on one of the most challenging fields in which the UN is involved, especially in the period when he was High Commissioner for Refugees. So, you know, the combination of those two things, plus whatever personal characteristics he may have, and I just don't know the man well enough to know what his personal characteristics are. But, you know, he comes across as a good communicator, as persuasive, as compassionate, you know, as a High Commissioner for Refugees, being able to speak on behalf of the people who really need to be spoken on behalf of. So I have high hopes.
That kind of brings me around to another one of the really fascinating topics that we were reading about, was the idea of a norms entrepreneurship of norms. And we were discussing kind of what other SG's legacies are in terms of those norms. Do you think is it too early to make a prediction for this time around?
Given his background, is it going to be focused on like a new concept of refugee protection, like R2P or democratic governance? Like,
that's an interesting question.
It's timely.
Yeah. I mean, there are some. The role of norm entrepreneur is an important one, and every Secretary General has the ability to do that. I'm not sure I can predict now. Are there certain new norms?
Right.
That, you know, but I do, and I'm going to talk about this later in the speech. I do see some areas where the normative climate and the legal infrastructure is weak and needs to be strengthened. And you know, the field of migration and refugees is one. You know, we have a refugee convention. We don't have any hard law on internally displaced persons. Not everybody who crosses the border counts as a refugee. On the other hand, you know, these people are often fleeing terrible situations, and there's really a sort of gap there in the legal architecture and even some of the normative principles that don't get concretized as hard law. And obviously he can make a difference on that one. You know, there's a lot around the challenge of violent extremism. And there's a lot of uncertainty about some of the legal principles that apply and how you go about addressing that problem. So I see some potential there, and I think he's got the potential to do it. But it's kind of more, you know, responding to circumstances than starting out saying, I'm going to now introduce the norm of R2P, the responsibility to protect, which ended up being part of the legacy of Kofi Annan. It wasn't his idea originally, it came from a blue ribbon panel. But that wasn't just because somebody said, you know, we ought to have a principle of R2P. It was as a result of Rwanda, Srebrenica, intervention in Kosovo. Political circumstances drove the international community, led by some norm entrepreneurs, to tackle this and ultimately try to give some bite to the notion of the responsibility to protect.
So we both sort of study migration and sort of asylum law and how that works. So it's interesting, and we have a friend who's interested in climate refugees because there currently isn't any protection for people fleeing environmental issues. So, I mean, the UN has done a lot with the COP21 and a lot towards climate change, so I can see those things tying in as well.
Great point. Environmental refugees is you know, a term that's sort of out there, but you know, what kind of norms or law do we have to address this?
What other crises do you think the UN? I mean, that's your talk later, but more onto the UNSC side of things, because I didn't.
Security Council side of things, yeah. Well, I mean, you've got the crises, the ongoing crises. Syria is obviously the big one, and a point I'll be making later is that the Secretary General inevitably has to make these crises a priority. It's not really a choice. I mean, he could decide, I don't really want to worry about Syria, but that's impossible. So some of these sort of priorities are going to have to be driven by circumstance, and Syria is one that he's going to inherit. South Sudan is another one. It's not on the front pages as much, that he's going to inherit, that are going to occupy a fair amount of his time. The other sort of coming back to the independent role of the Secretary General, what about the crises that the Security Council really can't deal with, in part because the Security Council membership makes it impossible. So the Security Council doesn't talk about Ukraine. The Security Council doesn't talk about the South China Sea. The Security Council has trouble talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because some of the 5 permanent members have a real stake in ensuring it doesn't get on the agenda of the Security Council.
Right.
So again, are these areas where the Secretary General should be sort of wading into precisely because it can't be addressed by the Security Council, or staying away from, knowing full well that the Security Council is not going to give him the kind of support he needs?
Right.
So those, I don't have an answer to that. But in trying to decide which crises are going to be priorities for him that are sort of chosen as opposed to forced upon him, that's a sort of calculation he's got to make.
It's kind of a perennial question, and it's not entirely fair because it comes up in a very speculative kind of way, but is there any way that there could be reform in the Security Council to allow the permanent 5 members to have some of their more uncomfortable issues brought to the forefront? I mean, it's difficult to have any sort of criticism within those powers because obviously they hold the preponderance of power when it comes to making the final cut. So you're asking about a kind of reform that doesn't necessarily entail expansion of the Security Council or removing the veto power, or you're asking about that as well. I mean, if you want to speak on that, feel free. I kind of avoid that because it's almost a moot point.
Well, I could say something about that, but let me sort of answer your question more directly. Which is, within the existing structure of the Security Council, it's hard to imagine getting around the problem of core interests of permanent members being kept off the agenda. But there is an initiative underway right now, for example, to have the members of the Security Council all agree that they won't vote no when genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity are being committed somewhere. So in other words, in particular, you're asking the 5 permanent members to pledge in advance, we will not use our veto in these situations. And it's not inconceivable to imagine them doing that as long as those situations don't implicate what's going on, within their countries or with close allies that they feel they need to protect.
What would hold them to that pledge, though?
Well, nothing other than the sort of court of public opinion, which again, we have to consider how influential is that. I mean, and by the way, by public, I mean people of the world, but also the governments of the world. So, if you made a public pledge and you take a step that demonstrates you're not living up to that pledge, you're exposing yourself to some international criticism. Now, how much that international criticism is going to have an impact if you've decided that your core interests are at stake and there's absolutely no way you're going to fulfill your pledge, then you'll do it. But you'll take some heat for that. And from my point of view, there's nothing lost by trying to insist on these pledges being made, and conceivably something can be gained from it. But holding them to their pledge in some coercive, sanctioning type way, no, it's impossible. It can't be done.
It's above that.
But don't forget that the also domestic public as well. So in Canada, in the United States. Well, this pledge, by the way, would apply to the 5 permanent members, but also every other member of the council. But it really matters for the 5 permanent ones because they're the ones who can vote no. But, in the United States, if there's a pledge like that, and then the American public sees that the government's not living up to its pledge,
Trust issue.
we're the criticism might come from within. And, that may be more true for some countries than others. For democratic countries, responsiveness to the public is greater than non-democratic countries.
Right.
Although it is one of those IR theorists like to point to the treaty-breaking tendencies of the world that even North Korea dropped out of the NPT before they decided to, try to violate it, or they avoid treaty breaking rather than be seen on the international level as though they'll sign on to something and then not keep with it. So there's this odd legitimacy even within countries without democratic pressure. At least at the international level, but I think it'd be really interesting to see democratically what kind of change there could be.
And the non-democratic countries are still trying to win friends and influence people around the world. So China is now actively engaged in building support,
Political capital.
tightening relations with a lot of African countries. So if China is seen as doing something in the Security Council which is deeply disconcerting to a majority of African countries, China will think twice.
It's interesting how sort of changing, not like the world system, but like alliances, and it's a different change than we've seen in the past. I think that'll be interesting in how we predict and understand international relations in the future, based on this change of people gaining support with other countries. In a way we haven't seen before.
Certainly shifting those global networks. So let's see, maybe this is kind of a step back towards where we were talking about the responsibility to protect and intervention by the UN and its mandate. So in those instances of intervention that require consent from a state for multilateral action, there is, we've discussed in class this issue that oftentimes the notion of consent and who can consent and what circumstances require that are defined by those who are requesting to participate, seeking it. Exactly. So is there a way to reconcile that conflict of interest? Like in what way is that checked by?
Your question is, those who are sort of seeking consent to take an action, for example, to intervene somewhere, are the ones who are defining who can legitimately provide that consent?
Exactly.
Is that the question?
And the circumstances under which it's mandated.
So in place where a country would be divided. Which side are they seeking consent from?
Oh boy, you're asking great questions. To which there are no simple answers.
Certainly.
And there's legal answers, and the legal answers are kind of fuzzy, and there's non-legal answers. So I have to think about this in sort of fairly concrete as opposed to abstract terms. If you're talking about a certain kind of intervention, if you're talking about a peace operation, peacekeeping, maybe robust peacekeeping, verging on a little bit of peace enforcement, you still are looking for consent. And ideally, you're going to get the consent of all of the main parties. Okay? So that will be first and foremost the host government, especially if it's the UN, because it's an intergovernmental organization and it's very hard to ignore the host government. But it will also mean the main opposition forces, the main rebel group or the insurgency or the representatives of a popular uprising and whatnot. So that's what you ideally want to get for that kind of intervention, which is fundamentally non-coercive, but might have some coercive dimensions to it if you're talking about a certain kind of peacekeeping. If you're talking about purely coercive intervention, meaning there's no sense that most of the actors on the ground want you there, and really you're just looking at who's the authority you're going to ask. That becomes a lot more complicated because even if you can identify an authority that either seems to have effective control in international law, the sort of principal standard is that the entity that has effective control over the country is the government, and you deal with that entity, and you don't ask too many questions about how legitimate that entity is. But as soon as you start looking at powerful, your question was about the country is divided, and so you've got a powerful insurgency that has effective control over part of the territory, then you don't have any obvious answer in terms of the effective control test. And then the inclination is to start asking, well, which one is more legitimate? Which one is more representative of
And that's where
a
assumptions
popular,
might come in.
that's
Legitimacy.
that's where legitimacy, the difficult part about this is legitimacy is often in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So, you want the consent of this group, which you have deemed to be the most legitimate group, but on what basis are you making that determination? Now, it's not to say it's impossible that there's no criteria you could use. At some level, in my view, and I think it's relatively widely accepted, legitimacy does depend on the degree of support and the perception of the population that is being governed, so to speak. Whether it's through Western democratic processes or in some other way, legitimacy does spring, at least in one definition, from that. And so you can start looking at that in some ways. But, it's a slippery slope, and it's a slippery slope that the concern is that, even in this exercise of where you look, is who's engaged in that exercise. Is Antonio Guterres the one who gets to determine you're legitimate and you're not, and so go ahead, get their consent and do whatever you want to do.
And is that often the case of why there might be inaction on the part of the UN, because the Security Council, for instance, might be divided on who recognizes who as being legitimate?
Yeah, although, in realpolitik, they kind of avoid the word legitimate.
Okay.
They're divided on who they support and who they believe is the effective authority that you deal with as an intergovernmental organization. Now, some countries like the US and France, I'm trying to think of where the UK would be on this one, but they're going to be more inclined to use the word legitimacy. But even if you sort of push them a little bit, you'll see that they don't want to go too far down that path because they realize that the criteria is so easy to manipulate. Legitimacy is not a legal principle. It hasn't been spelled out in any legal terms.
So if you'll entertain a metaphor briefly, with CPR and life-saving actions on an individual, lack of response implies consent. If there is no control, and if there's no force that grants stability to a region, for example, if the situation in Syria were to deteriorate to the point that there are no viable actors to give consent, is there a mandate for the UN to take action in order to save lives?
The mandate for the UN would have to come from the Security Council.
Okay.
So that sort of answers that question. If the Security Council can agree to give that mandate under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, then you don't need to worry too much about who's legitimate and who's not legitimate. The harder question is when the Security Council can't agree, is there some sort of right or responsibility to intervene outside of Security Council authorization? And this is the notion of the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention. And my view is that principle hasn't risen to the level of hard law in a way that you could say there's an international consensus that if the Security Council doesn't act, if the situation amounts to mass atrocities, neighboring countries, a coalition of countries can intervene as a matter of law. We're not quite there yet, but this has been a subject of debate for the last 10 or 15 years. Part of the reason it's not so much that people, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the sort of moral and emotional impulse to act, I think, is widely shared. The fear is selective application. And action for ulterior motives. You say it's for humanitarian purposes, but it's not.
So
it's not as if it's been a cover.
It's been a cover for lots of things. So I don't think you'll find many people or leaders around the world who would say, well, a genocide is occurring, but that's their problem, not our problem. It's just more if you start allowing unilateral humanitarian intervention, who's going to be engaging in this intervention? And is it going to be principally driven by humanitarian motives or other motives?